We love each of you, and we're glad to see you here with us. I need to get into the lesson pretty quickly because we have a lot of material to go over, but I wanted to remind you of the ball game that will be Friday night, the Lexington Legends ball game at 7:05. There is a quartet from the North Lexington Church of Christ that will be singing the national anthem before the ball game, so it'd be a great night for a lot of Christians to be together and support them and enjoy that singing as well as watching the game together. So the price is $7, I believe, for a ticket. You can pay for your tickets either to Richard or me, and we'll enjoy some fellowship together. And of course, remember the Friends Day next Sunday. The lesson will be on the Song of Solomon, so read the Song of Solomon this week, preferably with your spouse, and then we'll get together on Sunday and talk about Romance Unwrapped, God's book to married couples, Song of Solomon. Remember that next Sunday. Of course, fellowship will be on the early afternoon service as well. When I was in high school rather, I and my brother enjoyed watching Star Trek, and the Adams are here with us today, and I know you're big Star Trek fans as well. Saturday morning, Mom would say, "All right, it's time to set the table for lunch. Hold on, I'll do it during the commercials," because I had to watch Star Trek. When I got to college, we started watching The Next Generation. I like The Next Generation. In Star Trek, if you're not familiar with it, I'm sorry, but the Prime Directive was a law in the United Federation of Planets that guided the USS Enterprise and other ships that went out exploring the universe. And this law, the Prime Directive, said that members of the Federation could not mix themselves in with the cultures where they land in such a way as to disturb the culture. In other words, you could not introduce modern technology to ancient cultures and things like that. The Prime Directive, Captain Kirk and Captain Picard, as you might guess, frequently violated the Prime Directive because it made the episode more exciting. The Christian's Prime Directive is to teach the truth and don't alter the truth in any way. As we study the great apostasy this morning, we are going to see how Christians in the 2nd century, and really the early 2nd century, late 2nd century, did not follow the Prime Directive, and that's how we got from one church that Jesus established and his apostles preached to the 40,000 that we have in the world today by violation of the Christian's Prime Directive. Jesus died on the cross around 1833. He sent the Holy Spirit on the apostles some 50 days later, and the apostles began traveling around preaching and teaching that one faith. And we can see dotted across this map of the Mediterranean world where churches of Christ were established by the apostles, by deacons like Philip in Acts chapter 8, and by other Christians during the 1st century, up until the time that the Apostle John lived and died. According to early church tradition, the Apostle John is the last apostle to have died. He died somewhere around 95 to 100 AD. His books were the last books, as far as we know, that were written. The Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. Around AD 90, 95, maybe 100. So what happened after that? What happened in the next generation of Christians in the church? The word apostasy comes from the Greek word apo, which means away from, and stasi means to stand, or a state, or to be in a place. And so apostasy means a movement away from, literally. Today we use it in the sense of moving away from a set of beliefs or core principles or foundational faiths that we had at one time. Now, turn to Acts chapter 20. Brother Henry read this for us just a second ago, but let's take a look at it again. We'll turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 4, and then you can turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll read that at the very end of the lesson this morning. In Acts chapter 20, the Apostle Paul is meeting with some elders from the church in Ephesus. He is traveling back to Jerusalem so that he could be there for the Feast of Pentecost, so that he could preach once again to a large number of Jews assembled there that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And so he's traveling back to Jerusalem, and he stops off at Miletus, and he asks for the elders in Ephesus to come meet him there, and he has a conversation with them there, because it's the last time he says he's going to see them. And in the process of that last conversation, he says these words, beginning in verse 29, I know that after my departure, grievous wolves are going to enter in among you, not sparing the flock. And they are going to teach perverse things. These men that will arise among you will speak perverse things in order to draw disciples after them. And so this apostasy, Paul says, is going to come. And men are going to, the apostasy is going to start in the leadership of the church. And it's going to lead disciples away from the faith. There are other passages that deal with the coming apostasy. Turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 4, and we'll read some characteristics of the apostasy in this passage. But then I want us to spend most of our time looking at how did the church leave the faith, and in what ways. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. Paul says, the Holy Spirit speaks clearly or expressly that in latter times some will depart from the faith, that is, apostatize, paying attention to deceitful spirits and doctrines of demons, that is, doctrines that are instigated by the demons of Satan, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron, so their hearts become hardened to the truth, as being seared by a branding iron, and they start lying and deceiving people. Verse 3 says, men will begin forbidding to marry, and they will advocate abstaining from meats which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who, notice, believe and know the truth. Now, turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and keep your finger there because we'll get to that passage at the end of our lesson this morning. So we've got in the first century churches of Jesus Christ scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. Now, some of those churches are experiencing persecution. When we read the book of Revelation chapter 2, we read about a Christian by the name of Antipas in the Church of Christ in Philadelphia, who has in fact been killed for his faith. Now that's something, thankfully, that we don't have to worry about here in the United States, at least not right now. But the churches at that time were experiencing localized persecution. It will very quickly, in about 100 years, become an empire-wide persecution. But right now it's basically local. Well, as we progress through the first 200 years of church history, we need to keep in mind how we know what is going on. And you may have heard the expression that the winners write the history. Well, here are some history books that we have from the first couple of 100 years, basically in two groups of people. Church historians divide them up into two groups. One of them is called the Apostolic Fathers. These are the oldest writings that we have in existence today after the New Testament writings. They're called the Apostolic Fathers because they claim to be disciples of the apostles themselves. Most of the time, they were not right, but they claim to be apostolic writers. And this is a list of people that we can go through and read their writings. Sometimes their writings are only contained in quotations and other sources. But we can go through and read their writings. You can see where they're scattered. But notice the dates of these writings. They are about the time that the Apostle John lived and then the immediate generation after that. Now that doesn't mean that what they say is the correct interpretation of what the apostles wrote. It doesn't mean that. They could just as easily be wrong as we could. But how they viewed the Scriptures, they viewed it the same way we do today. Because they were looking at the writings, just like you and I try to go back and look at the writings themselves. And so we can place a good deal of weight on what they have to say and how things were done at that time. The second group of writers from the second and third centuries are called the apologists. The Greek word apology means to give a defense. And so the apologists were Christians who wrote in defense of the Christian faith. They either wrote in defense of the faith against the Jews, or they wrote in defense of the faith against the Gentiles, the pagan unbelievers. And so you can see the list of these people. And notice during the time that they wrote, the emperors under whom they wrote, that the dates of these men are about the time of John, or the generation after, or the generation after that. So we're about maybe 60 to 100 years after the Apostle John lived. So when we go through the early church history, we have these men's writings to help us understand what was going on. Point number one I want to bring out is about the cult of the martyrs. Now, the word cult here is not used the same way we use it today. The word cult, coming from the Latin, refers to those practices and behaviors related to venerating or worshiping someone. We can talk about the cult of our congregation, in which we talk about how we perform our worship services, our preaching and our singing and our giving and the Lord's Supper. That would be our cult, using it in this sense. Well, very early on, and these are pictures of the catacombs where they buried Christians, particularly in Rome and some other big cities, where they buried their Christians. Now, the cult of martyrs grew up around that practice of venerating their dead Christians. The earliest we can find reference to this is in Ignatius, it's 117. That's about 20 years after the Apostle John lived. Now, when Christians were persecuted, up to the point even of having to give their life for their faith, the other Christians really elevated them in their lives and in their hearts. And we do the same thing today in a sense. If we had a mama or a dad who was a very faithful and dedicated Christian and they've passed on, we really hold their Christianity to our hearts. So much so that a lot of times people will say, if my grandma or my mom is not in heaven, nobody could be. Well, that's the same attitude that these people had towards their fellow Christians who had died for their faith. If they gave a testimony, I am a Christian, and then was put to death for it, they were really elevated. Along with that comes the belief that, or rather, they talked about their Christians who had died for their faith in terms of athletes. The Greeks began the Olympic Games, and so they loved sports. And so they would use some of these athletic metaphors to refer to these Christians who have gone on and finished their race, that have finished the fight. And that helped elevate these Christians in the minds and hearts of these second and third generation Christians. Well, if somebody gives his life for his faith, if he has the courage to say, I believe in Jesus Christ, while he's tied to a post and he's about to have the wood underneath him set on fire, then the other Christians will say, wow, he must have a special grace given to him by God. It takes a special grace from God to be able to confess your faith at the point of death. And some people even believe that the Holy Spirit came on them at that moment to give them this special courage and faith in the face of death. Well, Jesus was believed to have been a martyr. He died for his faith. And so those who suffered and died for their faith were really, really following in the steps of Jesus, suffering for their faith. And that helped elevate them in the minds of the Christians. Well, again, through the Holy Spirit, their special grace was given to these Christians so that they could endure what they were going through. In fact, some of them even believed that the Holy Spirit gave them special visions, not unlike what Stephen received in Acts chapter 8, that gave them courage and helped them go through this period of persecution and even death. The Christians believed that their martyrs entered directly into the presence of Jesus. And because of that, because they had the strength of faith to confess in the face of death, then they even had special privileges in the presence of Jesus, even to the point of being able to forgive people's sins on earth. Now you may start beginning to see where the Catholic Church gets their idea of praying to their saints, and in particular to the Virgin Mary. And so if you die for your faith, you're in the presence of Jesus, you have special privileges so that you can talk to Jesus on behalf of people on earth, and you can even forgive sins of the people on earth. And death itself, before and without that,